Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Case Studies in the FTA Manual on Pedestrian and Bicycle Connections to Transit, with Edwin Rodriguez and Nathan McNeil. Today's webinar is co-hosted by TREC in partnership with the Federal Transit Administration, FTA. My name is Lisa Patterson. I will be your moderator for today. I'm the Tech Transfer and Workforce Development Program Manager for TREC, the Transportation Research and Education Center at Portland State University. TREC houses the National Institute for Transportation and Communities, NITC, and also administers the Initiative for Bicycle and Pedestrian Innovation, IBPI, and other transportation grants and programs. We produce timely, practical research useful to transportation decision makers and support the education of future transportation professionals through curriculum development and student participation in research. All right, our speakers today are Edwin Rodriguez and Nathan McNeil. Edwin is the Acting Director for the Office of Research Management, Innovation, and Outreach, TRI-30. TRI-30 is the office responsible to enhance the effectiveness of FTA's research program by driving research strategic planning, leading the program planning process for the selection of research and training, technical assistance, standards, human resources, training projects, overseeing program implementation and compliance activities to enhance project operational excellence, developing and applying research performance metrics and program evaluation efforts, managing agency research outreach efforts, and leading workforce assistance and training activities for the transit industry. Edwin is a 20-year veteran of FTA. He has worked in a number of offices across the Department of Transportation and within FTA. A collaborator, leader, and a person who gets things done well, Edwin is the consummate team player. He is always willing to go the extra mile on behalf of FTA's mission. In the last 2 years, Edwin addressed the backlog of TRI's congressional reports and vastly increased the quality of these documents. Edwin triple majored at the University of Maryland, College Park in international business, transportation and logistics, and marketing. Edwin enjoys mentoring others and helping students develop their professional skills. He has served as a mentor for student athletes at the University of Maryland and for new professionals at USDOT. In his spare time, Edwin enjoys drawing and painting, photography, traveling to his native country of El Salvador, following the Maryland football team and the U.S. national soccer team, as well as running a half marathon every month in his University of Maryland regalia. Nathan McNeil is a research associate at the Center for Urban Studies at Portland State University. He conducts research around impacts of new bicycle infrastructure and programs on travel behavior and attitudes towards cycling, shared use mobility programs including car sharing and bike share, and the connection between lane use and transportation. Nathan received a Master of Urban and Regional Planning from Portland State University and studied history at Columbia University as an undergraduate. Prior to PSU, McNeil worked for the Metropolitan Transportation Authority in New York City as a performance auditor where he evaluated capital programs and contracts. All right, before I hand it over to Edwin and Nathan, I'd like to give you a brief overview of the webinar. Edwin and Nathan will present for about 40 minutes. During this time, you can submit questions, which will be answered at the end of the webinar. We will be recording today's webinar and will make it available on our website. You will also receive the video recording and the presentation slides in an email following the webinar in the next day or two. If you are tracking professional development hours, this webinar is eligible for 1 hour of continuing education credit. Instructions on how to redeem the credit will also be included in the post-webinar email. We have a couple upcoming webinars to mention. On January 25th, Janet Barlow with Accessible Design for the Blind and Jim Elliott with Tool Design Group will be presenting on the Accessible Shared Streets, Notable Practices and Considerations for Accommodating Pedestrians with Vision Disabilities report. I'd also like to mention an upcoming partner event with the Graduate School of Education at Portland State University, the Mobility Matters Summit. It will be hosted here at Portland State University and it's on March 9th. You can check our website for more information. And then also, please note our Bike Ped Portal webinar presented by Hal Hagedorn at TREC, IBPI, and Portland State University has been postponed to March 7th. If you have previously registered, your registration has been automatically approved. Sorry about that. And there is no action needed on your part. All right. And lastly, before I hand it over, during the presentation, you may submit questions for Edwin and Nathan using the questions pane on your control panel. We'll track the questions and respond to them at the end of the webinar. If we run out of time, we will send out written responses for any questions left unanswered. And with that, I will now hand it over to Nathan and Edwin to talk about their research.
And good afternoon. On behalf of FTA, I would like to thank all of you for participating in this afternoon's webinar. Hopefully, it will be beneficial for you and that you'll be able to learn something new. FTA entering this cooperative agreement with Portland State University to create a manual to address pedestrian and bicyclist safety, accessibility, and mobility related to transit facilities and vehicles. The manual is aimed to benefit transit properties and travelers by compiling existing industry standards and best practices for the design and function of access points, bike parking, and associated amenities related to the multimodal transit facilities like rail, BRT station, rail crossing, bus stops, and vehicle design and bike share integration. This manual was a vision from our research office, and is a rich compendium of an existing standards, best practices, and treatments, and the effectiveness in current case studies that are actually in place. The intent of this effort on behalf of FTA was not to develop new standards, but rather the manual is to highlight policies, provide information on funding available through FTA for bicycle and pedestrian improvements, and addresses safety concerns around walking and bicycling. The manual also references documented applications of our sister agency, the Federal Highway Administration, funding opportunities to utilize flexible surface transportation program or congestion mitigation and air quality funding. This manual is also part of the United States Department of Transportation Safer People, Safer Streets, Pedestrian and Bicycle Safety Initiative. Before we move forward, this research effort on behalf of FTA had a lot of players. It was not just overseen or participated by one person. Within the Office of Research, Demonstration and Innovation in FTA, we would like to acknowledge the support of our Associate Administrator, Vincent Valdez, our Deputy Associate Administrator, Jamie Pfister, our Director for the Permanent Director for the Office of Research Management and Outreach, Mary Leary, and three of my colleagues within the Office of Research that were very helpful in completing this manual. One of them is Faith Hall, Mike Baltes, and Roy Chen. But we were not alone within the Office of Research in producing this manual. We have a lot of stakeholders and a lot of people who were very willing to participate and provide the best effort in order to ensure that the quality of the manual was the best possible. Among the FTA key involvement, we have our Executive Director, Matthew Welvis, Joanne Wozak, who is with the Office of Safety and Oversight, Richard Wong, who is with the Office of Chief Counsel, Valerie Burton, who is with our Office of Communications and Congressional Affairs, and Justin John, who is with our Office of Budget and Policy. And within DOT, we also have a lot of cooperation in order to make sure that the manual was not a duplicative one and that it was the most effective one possible. And within the Office of the Secretary, we have Barbara McCain, Anthony Burton, Paul Herbert, and within FHWA, we have Sherry Riplin, Daniel Goodman, and Gabriel Rusa. I just would like to acknowledge all of these individuals because it was a lot of cooperative effort within DOT in order for us to create this manual. But we could have not done this effort without our friends at Portland State University. I have to honestly tell you, it was a pleasure working with everybody who was involved in this manual. Thank you, Dr. Jennifer Dill, Nathan McNeil, Dr. Lynn Waygarn, Dr. Allison Duncan, Russ Doubleday, and Drew DeVitis. It was a pleasure working with all of you. And thanks to you, we have this really great manual, and hopefully all of you get to enjoy it. And with that, I will turn it over to Nathan McNeil, so he can tell you a little bit, well, actually add more of how we completed this manual and all the effort that it took to put this manual together and everything related to it. Nathan?
Great. Well, thank you, Edwin, and thank you, Lisa, for getting things started today, and to everyone for joining us online. And I appreciate everyone being able to join us today rather than the originally scheduled day. Looks like a lot of you were able to come back and join. A quick overview of what I plan to cover today includes a brief background on the manual, a discussion of the areas around a station or stop, factors relevant to pedestrian access and to bicycle access to stops and stations, and finally a discussion of some considerations for planning and implementing bicycle and pedestrian connectivity improvements. So with that, we got a lot to cover, so we'll get started. And there's also a lot in the manual that I won't be able to get to today, so hopefully you can have time to go look at that after this presentation as well. So one of the challenges that arise when seeking to improve conditions for walking and biking to transit is that multiple agencies and jurisdictions are involved. A pedestrian might begin a trip on a local road with a privately maintained sidewalk and cross a county road before arriving at a bus stop maintained by a transit agency. A bicyclist may ride on a local street to a trail maintained by a city parks department before arriving at a rail station owned by a transit agency. Efforts have to take into account all of these different players in terms of planning and implementation in order to really meet the needs of these potential transit users. One of the goals of the manual is to highlight the relevant existing resources, including reports, guidebooks, and research. There's a short section at the beginning of the manual that calls out a few of these key resources, but they're also referenced throughout the document. We also wanted to make it as easy as possible for the reader to access these resources. And so in the manual, you'll find blue italicized text in the electronic version whenever there's an active link to the document to go look at it yourself firsthand. And we encourage people to do that because there's a lot of great information out there. The manual also features detailed case studies of efforts in Los Angeles, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and in Atlanta. And we'll be pulling examples from those 3 locations and other places that we talked to throughout this webinar. And those are in the guidebook as well. So the manual highlights a number of benefits of making walking and bicycling connections to transit, and I'm going to touch on a couple here. First is that transit depends on safe pedestrian access. In most cases, transit users become pedestrians on at least one end of their journey. Having a safe and convenient way to walk to and from transit should be a primary objective. Next is improving walking and bicycling extends the reach of transit. So the further people can walk or bike to or from transit, the more useful the system is going to be to them. This serves to extend the reach of the transit system and expand the potential rider base. Another benefit to making it easier for people to use active transportation modes to get to transit is that it improves health and reduces congestion. So walking and bicycling to transit make the entire system healthier by providing physical activity for riders and resulting in less pollution than if they had taken a motor vehicle to access transit. For each of these benefits listed here, the manual also provides research supporting them, and so you can kind of look back to the original resources and have information to build the case for why we should be connecting walking and biking to transit. So to improve safety and increase transit use, transit agencies need to realize that transit service is door-to-door and not stop-to-stop. So with that in mind, we'll start by looking at the area around the transit stop or station. In addition to the needs of pedestrians and bicyclists at stops or stations and onboard vehicles, the needs of transit riders getting to and from transit via the surrounding streets is important. So in 2011, noting that poor first and last mile connections can be a barrier to accessing transit, the FTA released a policy statement whose goal was to encourage agencies and municipalities to improve walking and biking connections. The specified purpose was to simplify the process for determining whether a pedestrian or bicycle improvement qualifies for FTA funding by defining a radius around public transportation stops or stations within which FTA would consider pedestrian and bicycle improvements to have a de facto relationship to public transportation. A key statement from a key passage from that statement is shown here, which is, I'm going to read it because I think it's important. All pedestrian improvements located within 1/2 mile and all bicycle improvements located within 3 miles of a public transportation stop or station shall have a de facto physical and functional relationship to public transportation. Pedestrian and bicycle improvements beyond these distances may be eligible if they demonstrate that the improvement is within the distance that people will travel by foot or bicycle to use a particular stop or station. So this is the key part to realize, that the areas around the station are part of the transit project and part of the transit system, especially for pedestrians and bicyclists. An access shed, which is essentially what we were talking about in the last slide, is the area defined it's the area around a focal point to which a person would reasonably travel. Planners talk about pedestrian sheds, walkable catchment, and bike sheds. Access sheds are critical when considering transit because they're integral to understanding the number of people that could access a transit line, or put another way, how many people live or work within walkable or bikeable distance of a stop or station. And they also, and also whether people can get to the desired destination once they exit the transit system. So are they able to reasonably walk or bike from the station to their final destination? An access shed is most simply calculated as a certain distance radius from the station as the crow flies, shown here in this graphic from the Atlanta Regional Commission's Walk, Bike, Thrive plan. However, in actuality, pedestrians and bicyclists are constrained to the available sidewalks, crossings, and bike routes, and agencies are increasingly looking to network analyses to calculate the actual distances for both pedestrians and bicyclists using the available facilities. These true travel distances more accurately illustrate how far someone would be willing to walk, taking into account the existing street grid, the existence of potentially poorly connected networks, barriers to travel caused by things such as railway, freeway, or waterway crossing points and limitations. In this example from the North Central Texas Council of Governments Active Transportation Routes to Rail Study, that's a mouthful, the yellow lines represent half-mile walk sheds taking into account the existing sidewalk network. So you can see, a well-connected network makes a big difference in how far someone could get within half a mile of walking. And this is an extreme example, but it shows the difference. And here's an example of a bike shed, and note that a network access shed on a perfect grid would be diamond shaped as the ability to ride extends out. But barriers of various types, including man-made barriers like rivers, natural barriers like rivers, or man-made barriers like highways, can alter the shape of the shed, as we see in the bike shed example. And you see that little chunk out of the right side caused by the inability of the cyclist to get across the freeway that kind of cuts through the middle of that diamond there. LA Metro, in its first last mile strategic plan, developed a program to improve and expand access shed for users traveling to and from stations. And they propose to do this by increasing the average speed of active transportation users through measures that decrease crossing wait times, such as signal prioritization, and improved walking and biking speeds, and capacity through route improvements, by decreasing the distance needed to access stations by fixing gaps in the network, adding crossing opportunities, and exploring creating shortcuts. And finally, by improving intermodal connectivity, by improving wayfinding and multimodal links, and enhancing communication through better signs and wayfinding. This graphic does a pretty good job of showing how an improved walk and bike network can effectively increase the service areas of transit by taking some of these measures. I'm going to take a few minutes and talk about pedestrian access and their needs for accessing transit. Pedestrian access depends on a number of factors, with sidewalks and crossings being key components. This graphic from the Santa Monica Action Plan shows many of the key considerations and factors that influence the suitability of sidewalks and crossings. In general, sidewalks should provide clear space for passage while taking into account other possible activities, from accessing buildings, as in the frontage zone shown in the diagram to the left, to features that increase comfort, like trees and benches. In the furniture zone, that can also be used for bike racks and that sort of thing, trash receptacles. But the key point is to have, you know, a walkable area where people can get by and get where they want to go. Quality crossings also are important. They should minimize the distance pedestrians need to travel and the time they need to wait. This is an example of a full pedestrian crossing in Minneapolis, and you can see the light rail stop and with light rail train waiting at the far side of the crossing, so it's as close to the transit stop as possible. Improving crossings can involve shortening the crossing distance by adding full or half signals, enhanced crosswalks, and more. And then another thing that's important for pedestrian access is wayfinding to and from stations that caters to pedestrians. These signs directing pedestrians to MARTA rail stations in Atlanta to the entrances from the surrounding streets help make it easy to find finding and accessing stations. On the left, the column there kind of you can pick that out from, you know, a block or two away, and on the right is a sticker on the pavement that kind of points people in the direction of the local transit without even having to lift up their heads. So I thought these were kind of clever ways to show people how to get to the nearest station. And I'm going to go into a short case study here. So in this example from Atlanta, we learned that improving the road environment to and around bus stops can have a huge impact on the rider experience and rider safety. Many of you may have heard of the Buford Highway in Atlanta and suburban Atlanta. It's a 6-lane arterial that originates in Midtown Atlanta and serves as a vital connection to the northeast suburbs. In the last 15 years, a heavily transit-dependent Hispanic population grew up along the highway, increasing the number of people that needed to access transit and along the busy arterial. The still automobile-oriented route had limited crossings, sidewalks, and other pedestrian infrastructure, leading to conditions that had led to numerous pedestrian deaths and injuries over previous years. The inset photo of a person walking in the travel lane on the right is not an uncommon sight if you go and look at past Google Street views of the Buford Highway, and it kind of gives you a sense of what the environment was like there. Recognizing the need for improvements, Atlanta's transit agency MARTA worked with the Georgia Department of Transportation to get investments in sidewalks, raised medians, and crossing signals along a dangerous just over 2-mile stretch of the Buford Highway. And the image here shows a bus stop accessible by a connected sidewalk as well as an enhanced crosswalk. And the next slide shows another view of that crosswalk with the bus stop on the far side. It's just out of the picture to the left. You know, just some basic improvements that make it a lot safer for people to get to and from transit and around to the local destinations there. I'm going to move on to a discussion of some of the needs for bicyclists of accessing transit. And so one of the first things, and as we talked about wayfinding with pedestrians, also important for bicyclists. So bicycle networks around the station are also incredibly important. They should be safe, comfortable, and connected. And then wayfinding signs play a role in directing cyclists to the station and within the station as well to where they need to go. And we do briefly, in the manual, we briefly touch on, you know, some of the ways to improve both bicycle and pedestrian networks, although really the idea is more to point people to where that information is in other sources, because we are not, you know, this guidebook wasn't about networks as much as the transit, the access to transit itself. So moving on to bike parking at stops and stations. So while stations have found that many people who access transit by bike would prefer to take their bikes on board, providing bike parking is still an important role for transit agencies. Many agencies have restrictions on when you can take your bike on board, and oftentimes that's restricted during peak hours. In either way, capacity for taking bikes on board is often limited. Standard bike racks are an inexpensive way to provide parking, and they can be placed in an open plaza area or under cover to provide protection from the elements. Whenever possible, it's important to place racks in areas that are easily observable as a form of passive security for them. One simple solution that transit agencies have taken to help prevent theft is providing racks inside of station areas after fare gates, so in kind of somewhat restricted areas. The example on the left is from MARTA in Atlanta, but the station is the practice is also common in the BART system, amongst others. Bike lockers are also a relatively common form of secure bike parking and provide enough room for cyclists to leave some of their gear as well. Typically, these are rented out semi-annually or annually with key or key card access, though some agencies are implementing on-demand e-lockers that can be rented out daily or even hourly, and these provide a little bit more flexible of an option. A step up from individual bike lockers are bicycle rooms and cages, which have often become preferred by some agencies when funding allows. They're usually accessed by a key code, or card key, and typically have video monitoring for additional security. Oftentimes, they have two-tiered racks to increase efficiency, and they're generally best suited for station areas with more space. They're often seen in parking garages and park and ride facilities, for example. When providing bicycle rooms, it's also important to consider non-standard bike parking options, such as accommodating trikes, cargo bikes, recumbents, and tandems, amongst other options. The examples shown here are from the TriMet Southeast Park Max station along the Orange Line. And they just provide, lower areas where people can lock up different types of bikes, or even we've seen people locking up shopping carts to not, like they're the push shopping carts, and other other things to these that maybe they couldn't accommodate or keep elsewhere. A few agencies are installing versatile racks. We haven't identified yet any specific policies regarding who would or should be eligible to use these bike parking spaces. As you can see, the one there is marked as wheelchair user, but there are not, I don't think, actual restrictions on who can use that, nor are there permits at this point. And I'd be interested at the end if people have suggestions or thoughts on if there should be. But as far as I know, there are no, nobody's gone to that step yet. And then transit agencies have also started to think more about the whole ridership experience for bicyclists, and are beginning to provide innovative facilities such as bike hubs, which typically feature secure bike parking, bike repairs, bike rentals, classes and events, and some items for purchase, particularly for repairing flats or essential parts of the bicycle. This is a picture of LA Metro's bike hub at the El Monte station on the Silver Line, and membership passes are available there on weekly, monthly, or yearly basis. And this was the first of 5 planned bike hubs throughout the Metro's, I guess through the first phase of Metro's bike hub plan. Of course, the other component to bicycle access to transit is the getting the bikes on transit itself. So when thinking about bicycle access to transit, a key component is the integration between bicycles and transit vehicles. 60% of transit trips in the U.S. are taken by bus, and allowing bikes to be brought on board is extremely important. Transit agencies have made a lot of progress in the last 15 years. In 2001, only 32% of buses were equipped with external bike racks. And as recently as 2013, that number was up to 74%, so you can see there's been a lot of progress in that time. Some agencies are increasing capacity from 2 bikes to 3 bikes, though some are finding that they need to address issues such as the consistency of use across their fleets, so that both drivers and transit users are kind of familiar with what they're going to expect when that bus pulls up or when they're driving that bus, in the case of the operators, obviously, and also in terms of the handling and turning radius of the buses for the operators. So there's some things to consider in terms of the difference between the 2 and the 3 bike racks. And then, transit agencies have also integrated bikes with light rail vehicles. Common configuration there. A common configuration there is are bike hooks where a bike can be held vertically upright, as shown on the left, or else flip-up seats where space can be used to accommodate bikes. Open areas, such as that shown to the right, are not uncommon, particularly on heavy rail systems. And then transit agencies are also generally welcoming of folding bikes on board, particularly since they can easily be folded and placed under seats or otherwise take up somewhat limited amount of space. A few systems even have bicycle-specific cars. This one is from the MBTA system in Boston, although it's still pretty uncommon to see this sort of a car, and they tend to be on more, getting cyclists out to recreational areas on weekends, for example. And then looking at the area, we go into more detail in the manual, but I do want to touch on a few important stop or station aspects that are important to pedestrians and bicyclists at the station, and really for anyone who's using the station. Station comfort basics include providing seating and shelter to protect from the wind and rain. Comfort, safety, and security matters to all transit riders, but it may be more important for pedestrians and bicyclists who may have to wait for longer areas or maybe have come through the elements to arrive at this location, and so that the shelter may be more valuable for them. Or they may be in more exposed areas, so they're not, perhaps waiting in a car for a bus or a train to arrive, for example. Station components that universal design applies to include audible cues for arrivals, wider walkways to accommodate a wide range of users with mobility devices, amongst other things. In Minneapolis, I thought this was a pretty good graphic of some of the components that they've put into one of their bus stop designs. So they have several current or recent. So this is from the recently implemented A-line arterial bus line that included specially branded and outfitted stops. The design includes 10-foot pylons that can be seen from a block or more away and flash when a bus is within a minute away. Comfortable shelters with lighting and heat, ample width to accommodate wheelchairs around the shelter, audible arrival cues, and vicinity maps. I'm going to go through some of what those letters represent here. So the utility boxes, pylon markers, real-time displays, and the shelter. I'm not going to read all of the rest of these, but you can see, and these will be available in the slides, other features to kind of make, so trash and recycling containers to make it sure it's clean, light fixtures, benches, bike parking are amongst the items there. I'm not sure what that was. Some sound effects. Hand in hand with planning improvements to walking and bicycling access to transit is the implementation of those efforts. And as you'll see, these processes, planning and implementation, are closely tied and cyclical. In our time talking with transit agencies working in this area, we heard that a key component in being successful at integrating walking and bicycling with transit is the idea that the agency culture should embrace and prioritize these modes, both in official policy and in culture. This takes at least a few shapes, and I'll talk about a couple here. First, prioritizing walking and bicycling for transit access. So, as I mentioned earlier, walking is a foundational element of transit. Everyone becomes a pedestrian at some point along their journey, and bicycling shares the environmental and health benefits and can expand the reach of transit systems in a low impact and minimally resource intensive way. These modes should be at the top of a transit mode hierarchy. Next, transit agencies should clarify policies and staff responsibility for walking and bicycling. So having specific policies and dedicated staff are things that can help to actualize goals in this or really any area. Clear roles and responsibilities can help ensure that nothing slips through the cracks because one agency or employee thought somebody else was tackling it, for example. or that they didn't have, that their time is dedicated to some other task within the agency. And then finally, agencies should seek to lead by example, which means considering the ways to support staff who want to include walking and biking in their commute to work or for conducting work-related travel. This can range from providing quality bike parking and shower facilities, providing healthcare cost incentives for active transportation, helping with trip planning, and more. And then to reiterate a point made at the beginning of the presentation, the topic of bicycle and pedestrian access to transit needs to be tackled in a collaborative manner between transit agencies, local jurisdictions, and other groups. Transit infrastructure often crosses jurisdictional lines, which provides MPOs and transit agencies with an opportunity to convene parties together for collaborative efforts. Bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure is also increasingly seen through the regional network lens. So these regional government bodies can be leaders in fostering safe and accessible bicycle and pedestrian connections to both existing and to future transit service. And then finally, one of the things that we heard a lot in our conversations was that the planning process is a great place to develop relationships across agencies and across jurisdictions that can be built upon later on down the road and in the implementation phase. So just knowing the person to call that's in charge of bicycling or walking at the county or at a city where the bus stops down the road, knowing who to call in those places can really make those relationships easier and getting things done a lot easier. One of the things that we heard a number of times during this project was also the importance of having identified, prioritized, and documented needed improvements and investments through a planning process. And the fact that an agency could point to an improvement that they had already identified made it a lot more likely that when they applied for a grant to make an improvement, that they would be a lot more competitive because they had gone through the planning process already and they had identified this as something that should happen. Funding for these improvements can come from FTA, including improving access sheds through the stations per the FTA policy on first and last mile connections, and from other federal sources. Many cities are seeking local funding initiatives, such as through ballot measures, to invest in transit and walking and biking elements. And it's a good place to find funding that has fewer restrictions placed upon it. And then, so two good resources to consult on funding walking and biking improvements to transit are shown here. One is an FHWA resource that is updated with different potential funding streams and the types of projects that can be funded through them. And then it's a few years old now, but the Advocacy Advance first and last mile funding document is a useful resource. And then to close things out here, I'm going to briefly touch on three particularly relevant types of plans that agencies are developing. First, pedestrian access plans focus on improving pedestrian access to transit stops through a process of identifying specific or general areas of needs, identifying a toolkit of best practices and solutions, and proposing improvements to address the needs that they've found. They often focus on sidewalks, crossings, and transit stop factors that are likely to affect pedestrians, such as access points and locations, seating, shelter, and lighting. And as you can see here, an example of this is the TriMet pedestrian network analysis. And again, the links to all of these are included in the manual document and to other plans as well. Bike access plans focus on improving access to transit stop for bicyclists. Major areas of focus include bicycle parking at stop locations, onboard accommodations for bicycles, and having first and last mile bicycle network connections that allow people to ride to and from transit comfortably. And as you can see here, the BART bicycle plan, it's a good one to look to get a sense of what you can include in this sort of a plan. And again, we have the link to this in the manual itself. And first and last mile plans focus on completing the transit trips for passengers by examining how they got from their origin to to the stop or station where they board transit, and how they get from the final stop to their final destination. First mile, last mile plans generally start with a recognition that transit ridership depends on people being able to access it. Pretty basic concept, but it's worth really going into in detail to think about how that actually happens. Improving conditions for pedestrians and cyclists in the areas around the origin and destination stops can extend the effective reach of the transit system and thereby increase the potential ridership base, as well as making the transit process just smoother, faster, more enjoyable for people. And then before opening up the webinar to questions, I just want to thank all of the many staff members at agencies around the country who made themselves available to us through emails, calls, meetings, tours, and more. As you can see, it represents not just those 3 areas of Atlanta, Los Angeles, and Minneapolis, St. Paul, but also other cities and counties and transit agencies around the country. So thanks to everyone who we reached out to, who gave us great information and documents and all of that. It really went into making the product what it is. And then finally, I want to encourage you to download the full manual, as I've mentioned. Here's the link. I've created this tiny URL to make it a little bit easier if you're writing it down. But these will also be available in the PDF download and on the webinar webpage. And if you're interested, there's a one-page summary of the manual available to look at as well. And then finally, I just want to acknowledge the rest of the PSU project team that worked on this document and really did a lot of the work to make it what it is. And so with that, I am open to questions, and I believe, as Lisa mentioned at the beginning, the chat is probably, or I guess the question box is the way to do that. So I'm open. And Lisa, did you want to moderate that?
Yeah, great. Thank you for your presentation, Edwin and Nathan. Really great stuff. For those viewing the webinar, as Nathan mentioned, you can continue to submit questions if you have them in the questions pane, but it looks like we have a couple to get us started. So first question on the FTA policy for the first and last mile. You used a 3-mile bike shed. Can you discuss where this number came from and were lesser numbers considered? And are you aware of any rational or case study example of station area network planning with a reduced bike shed radius?
I can't speak to, I think that was based on, I should back up. I do know, there is some basis in the research for the average bicycle trip, if you look at, people commuting, is somewhere around 3 to 4 miles. The distance that people would ride to access transit tends to be a little bit less than that. But I think that, I imagine FTA, when they developed that policy, were looking at kind of the best available information on kind of what the average bike trip was. But I think it's important to note that agencies and cities don't have to extend that out to 3 miles, but they are able to. So if they wanted to focus more of their effort and energy on improvements within the immediate mile around the station or stop, I think they would be free to do that. But this acknowledges that really the network, even extending out beyond that mile, up to 3 miles, can be important. And then it's also important to note that the policy doesn't, what it allows for, and actually let me pull that back up because it's a good thing to have in front of us. If I can get back there, so we'll go back through a bunch of slides. But what it allows for is that if you can prove that the benefit or that the bikeable area is beyond 3 miles, you can include improvements beyond 3 miles. So it doesn't really say, oh, you can use a smaller area. So I hope that's helpful. And I don't know, Edwin, did you have anything you wanted to add to the FTA's determination of that distance?
Actually, I do.
Okay,
And
great, perfect.
besides of what you said, which is very accurate, it also is a case-by-case basis. It's not like a standard cookie cutter for all of the projects related to bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure or improvements that you're doing. Is something that you will have to work with FTA and our regional folks and our Office of Planning and Environment to see if you need more than the distance required or stipulated in the policy. So correct. So it's basically a case-by-case basis. It's just and you nail it when you mention about the research done. And also to mention that this only applies to the transit side and the Department of Transportation, meaning FTA. The other reason why we did what we did is because we didn't want to overlap with Federal Highway Administration. They have a different set for their program and their fundings. So it would be worth for you to check depending on your city and on your project.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. All right. So there are known ADA requirements for vehicle parking, number of spaces, location, etc. Have you seen any move toward requirements for ADA parking provisions in bike facilities? Do you know of any good rules of thumb for larger facilities?
That is a really good question, and I don't know of minimum requirements for alternative, biking accommodations, and part of that is because very few places. Well, so I guess just to start, very few places have alternative bike parking. And they're really just starting to recognize that a standard bike rack doesn't work for for various kinds of bicycles that aren't kind of a standard two-wheel or upright bicycle. So I don't think that there are. And maybe I'd ask the people on the webinar to tell me if they have any other information on if there are any places that have required alternative bike parking. But I'd say a good practice is to have at least one type of lower a lower bar that is available for someone to lock to in an area like in a bike lot in a bike room, for example. If you have one or two alternative racks, that's beneficial. And it doesn't have to be denoted in all cases as like this is a wheelchair-friendly space. But if you have some variety in the height and in the length of the bars, it does give people different people that can't quite use the standard bar. It gives alternatives. But I do think this is something that's worth some further looking into, and particularly as we start to see more alternatives for different kinds of bicycles.
Mm-hmm. Great. All right. This is a question back to the access sheds again. Did you consider topography or other environmental factors in analyzing access to transit?
Yeah, so I don't know if any of the examples that I included in the webinar did. I don't, the bike, let me go ahead. The bike shed example, it may have taken into account topography, but that's a good question. And so if you really want to do a full bike shed or walk shed analysis, that is the sort of thing that you would want to take into account. So if, for example, there was a very hilly area to the left of the center of this station, we would reasonably expect people wouldn't go as far in that direction, and so the diamond would be kind of smaller in that portion of the area, and the bike shed would be smaller in that area. So that is the sort of thing you'd want to take into account. You'd also want to take into account other factors, and this and this depends on what your how much time you have to spend on this sort of analysis and what kind of data you have. And so you can do it quickly and just look at the network. You can also take into account various factors. If you really want to go into it and you have the data, you can take into account how many stop signs does a cyclist have to go through and how much does that affect their willingness to ride in a certain location. What is the traffic, next to a bike lane, and how does that affect their willingness to ride there? So there are a number of factors that you could take into account, and I think it's just, and there's some research out there that we point to some of it in the manual, and if you have other questions, feel free to get in touch with me. I can kind of point you to some other places if they're not in there. But it again depends on how much time and how much information you have to conduct the analysis.
Mm-hmm. Great. And one more question on access sheds. Can you revisit or touch on the measures that support the goal of increasing the access shed? For example, the reduction by signal prioritization.
Yeah, so it's essentially, the measures are essentially relate to things that make the trip faster for someone walking or biking, more enjoyable, so makes them kind of more willing to walk or bike further, or just more direct, so taking away barriers. So if there's a highway that has no crossing for a mile, that's going to be a huge barrier to someone trying to walk or bike to a stop on the other side of that highway. And so maybe putting a pedestrian bridge, and that's a pretty large-scale intervention type of change, but that kind of directly makes that connection very direct. And a smaller scale or a smaller cost improvement of that sort might be, putting a shortcut through through a parking lot and maybe there's a fence on the far side of the parking lot. Well, if you can work with the landowner, or if it's public land, you can create an opening there and a nice path through. That might be a pretty low-cost way to create a pretty a nice shortcut. So yeah, if you're thinking about kind of the quality of the facilities, the crossings, and the creating potential new facilities. So those are all sorts of things that can. And I guess let me go back to that slide. Again, the reality in most places is restricted by whatever those barriers are. That's the center there, where it doesn't, where you're not quite getting out to what you would expect if there were a perfect network. But the goal is really to make the walking and biking environment so nice that people would actually go further than whatever the policy is. So maybe further than a half mile or a mile walking, further than 3 miles biking. If it's really easy to do it, you get more people that would be willing to do it.
Mm-hmm. Great. And then in regards to the prior question, one of our audience members had a comment about an example that you can look at is the Metro's Active Transportation Strategic Plan took into consideration typology when determining the walk and bike shed. So that's a resource for that typography. And so a couple audience members has questions on the resources and the collaboration that was used for the report. So how is the work that went into this document being coordinated or has been coordinated with the APTA bike accessibility work that's being completed?
So that's a good question. So most of the work that went into this was completed in the fall of 2016. So unfortunately, we didn't have a lot of opportunity to coordinate with them, though I will be in touch with them and, thinking about how these pieces fit together. But I think, again, the idea here is to connect people to, all of these great resources that are out there and that exist. And, it's not creating new policies or guidelines. But kind of pointing people to where there's stuff out there for them to get to. But yeah, I wish that if we had been putting these together at the same time, and even though this one's coming out now, it was most of the work was done a little while ago.
Okay, great. And can you talk more about the resources you selected for determining bicycle parking needs? You had mentioned the TCRP Report 153, the guidelines for providing access to public transportation stations, but are there others, or is that particular one more important or utilized more?
That's one I'll have to get back to them on. I'll look into that. Off the top of my head, I don't remember.
Okay, great. Yeah, and that's a great reminder. There are a couple questions it looks like we probably won't have time for, but we will send out written responses to those questions for those that get unanswered, left unanswered. Okay. Does the manual address the difference between high stress and low stress streets for walking and biking?
So the manual addresses briefly some of the measures that can be taken to reduce the stress of the walking or biking environment. So going from basically what are the types of facilities that are more preferred by people using by people walking or biking. But again, this manual is not going to help agencies identify specific facilities that they should be selecting. It's more to point out that here's a range of things that they can be using, and they should be looking at the design manuals and for what the network facilities should be. So kind of it just makes them aware that they exist, but is not a resource that is going to be that you should be using to select what kind of route to build for pedestrians or bicyclists.
Okay, great. And we'll end here with one more question. Is FTA aware of good tools to quantify walk-bike access improvements to transit or transit ridership?
I'll jump in, and I don't know if Edwin has anything to add, but I'll just say there are a few linked in the manual. There are a few tables that show different ways that agencies have, different factors they've taken into account to assess, to prioritize improvements and kind of what benefit they would bring to the overall network. So that's one thing to take a look at. And then I also know that there are a number of FHWA documents that have come out and I think still to come that really do look at connected networks and what are the benefit of different elements to making that network complete. So I think take a look at what's in the manual, but then also look at those FHWA resources. And Edwin, do you have anything to add to that?
I was going to point them out to the FHWA resources as well. They have more extensive work on bicycle and pedestrian, more so than FTA does. We're cooperating with them, and hopefully we're going to start exploring different areas that we probably haven't touched or need to touch. And questions like this ones are actually good ones that will allow us to start thinking of what we need to do next. So keep the questions coming.
Great.
All right, great. Well, Edwin or Nathan, did you have any other final thoughts or comments that you wanted to add before we conclude the webinar?
I would just say thanks everyone for joining, and Edwin, if you have anything.
That's all I was going to say too. Thank you very much everyone for joining and for the questions, and looking forward to working with you again.
Great. Well, thank you again. And for those of you viewing the webinar, have a great day. And just as a reminder, I'll go ahead and show the links for where you can download the FTA guidebook, find out more information about our upcoming events. And as a reminder, we will send PDF slides of the presentation today in the post-webinar email. All right. Thanks again, everyone. Have a great day.